Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. First person shooters are some of my favourite games. Done right, they can have the best action around. I started playing them way back in the 90s with a little indie game called Doom released for DOS, though you've probably never heard of that. Since then, I was hooked, and I sought to play as many of these first-person games, or Doom clones as they were known back then, as I could. And boy, there were a ton of them. So in this video, we're going to see if any of them came close to blasting Doom off the top spot, or if they were instantly shot in the face with a shotgun. Now, what is annoying is I actually had a bunch more games that I was going to include in this video, but my Steam has stopped working on my computer, so I couldn't access the likes of Blake Stone, Rise of the Triad, or Dark Forces. But it's alright, it means I'll have to do a part 2 at some point. Also, you will notice there are no Doom or Duke Nukem games in this video, as they have enough games in their series to get a video of their own. Don't worry, they're on my to-do list. I really love these old school shooters, so make sure you comment below to let me know any that I might not be aware of that are worth checking out. Now, how about I shut the hell up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games.
On Windows 95.
First up is Alien Cabal, released in 1997 from QA Soft, and for a game released in 1997, it really is not very impressive, though it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure. The story is probably what you expect. UFOs have landed and aliens have invaded. The government tries to cover it up, but they didn't do a particularly good job of it, and in the end they decide to send in a lone operative to infiltrate the alien bases, which have appeared out of nowhere, and of course they need to wipe out any threats. The graphics here are kind of basic, but they do have a certain charm to them. The environments are very boxy and not impressive at all, though they are clear. However, when you're inside buildings or bases filled with corridors, which is most of them, it's hard to tell them apart. Thankfully, you do have a map, which helps a lot. Enemies are mostly pre-rendered and there isn't a huge variety. You've got cloned men in black, robots, aliens, and of course, bees. And that's about it. They all have only a handful of frames of animation and it all looks kinda cheap. Also, there's no bosses at all, which is really a strange thing to leave out. In terms of weapons, there's hardly any of those either. And what's here isn't exactly groundbreaking. You have a pistol, a shotgun, machine gun, rocket launcher and grenades, and that is it. Most of the weapons can be found on the first 2 levels, so you'll have seen pretty much everything there is here very quickly. The controls here do work, but they're pretty damn sluggish and basic. You can move and strafe as well as look up and down. You can't jump, but like in Doom, if you're moving fast enough you can make it across most gaps, though it's not very often that you have to do this. Also, there is mouse aiming, but only for left and right, so I just didn't bother for the most part. There's only about 10 levels here, and they are the usual thing of exploring narrow corridors filled with enemies, collecting weapons and finding keys so you can get to the exit. There's no other objectives. Now, while this is clearly a very basic and cheap looking game, I did find that it was actually kind of enjoyable. Despite the sluggish controls and slow turning, coupled with some crappy stock sound effects and graphics, the fact that this only has a handful of levels is kind of a blessing, as you can beat it in just a few hours before it totally wears out its welcome. But do I recommend it? Well, no, not really. There really is no reason for anyone to play this considering the amount of awesome DOS shooters out there. However, it is available just about everywhere for free and it runs fine on DOSBox. So if you do love these games and want one that's kind of crappy but quirky, then maybe do give this one a shot. In stark contrast to Alien Cabal, here is Blood, which is one of the best first-person games of the 90s. Made by Monolith Software, this is a horror-themed shooter where you play as Caleb, who is screwed over by the devil, you don't say, and he sets out to get revenge, taking out cultists and all manner of crazy monsters and bosses. The game looks fantastic, with huge varied levels that take you from a carnival to the ice caps and all the way to hell, not to mention everywhere in between. The levels all look great with a ton of detail, nice lighting and a lot of interactive furniture. This game is made with the Build engine, which was made famous by Duke Nukem 3D, and you can see the similarities here, especially when it comes to things like blowing holes in walls and destructible environments. You get a ton of really cool weapons, starting with a pitchfork that's actually really powerful. Then you get a flare gun that sets people on fire, along with shotguns, machine guns and dynamite, and even some voodoo weapons that pack a hell of a punch. and you are going to need them because this game is stupidly hard, even on the easier difficulties. It's filled with hit scanning enemies, which means that anyone with a bullet based weapon is basically always locked onto you if they can see you, and you can go from having full health to dying in just a few seconds. This difficulty can make the game hard to get into initially, as you'll be dying a lot, and I really do mean a lot. Enemies here take a ton of hits and ammo can be scarce, though if you stick with it, you'll learn to use cover effectively and not just run in everywhere guns blazing, and you'll soon build up a good arsenal and you'll be kicking the crap out of the hordes of crazy enemies. You can also find power-ups that will help you out by making you invisible, invincible, or things like jumping higher to reach hidden areas packed with health and ammo. The levels themselves are all pretty damn huge, and again, you'll need to explore to find keys and levers that open up areas so you can find the exit. The game's divided up into 5 chapters, each with about 10 levels, so there really is a lot of bang for your buck here. The spooky atmosphere, tongue-in-cheek humour and crazy weapons just make this so much fun to play, but you do have to get over the fact that you will be killed every 30 seconds, as enemies tend to kill you before you even know they exist most of the time. But this really is an FPS game that everyone should play. It's one that I would love Night Dive Studios to bring to consoles like they did with Doom 64 and Exhumed, but I don't think that will happen anytime soon. But anyway, if you're tough enough, then see if you can play through this one in one of the higher difficulties. Or, if you're like me, give up trying and resort to cheats after about 5 levels. Either way, you're going to have a great time with this one. Highly recommended. Depth Dwellers was released in 1994 from Trisoft and sees you heading into said depths of the Zendel mines to rescue the men that have been trapped down there by some evil bastards. Now, this game is not good in just about any way. It seems to play more like Wolfenstein 3D, but not as good. You make your way through identical looking corridors trying to find prisoners and fighting off ugly, boring looking enemies. The enemies here all look bad with some incredibly pixelated sprites that have barely any animation, and they look like they were drawn by school children. The enemies have a number of weapons that will pretty much just lock onto you and fire a barrage of crap that is really hard to avoid thanks to slow ass controls and narrow corridors. However, some of their weapons you can actually shoot the projectiles they fire at you, which is quite interesting. And you'll find a few weapons laying around, but none of these are particularly interesting and just fire energy bolts. Navigating the levels here is the biggest issue I had though. As mentioned before, everything just looks the same and it's almost impossible to know where you've been and where is new, unless you come across the bodies of defeated enemies of course. There's a ton of hidden areas here too as well. These can be spotted usually by a bit of the wall or something like that having moss or a crack on it. Just walk up to these walls and they'll open up to rooms. These often hide treasure which give you points, whoopee, health and ammo, which can be useful. Also, often you'll need to find these rooms as they have the keys you need to progress. And also, if you do get enough treasure, you will get an extra life. You do, of course, need to find these keys so you can get to the exit teleporter on each level, though the problem is normally that once I find the key, I can't then for the life of me find the door that I need to use it on thanks to the crappy level design and repetitive graphics, and of course, to make it worse, there is no map here for you. The music on the game is also just as mind-numbing, with annoyingly slow tunes playing throughout the game that are more likely to make you want to go to sleep than they are exciting, and a game like this should have exciting, pumping tunes to get you in the mood for killing. There really is very little to no positive thing for me to say about this game. I really didn't enjoy pretty much any second of my time with it, and I highly doubt you will either. Don't bother with this one unless you're a real sucker for bad games. Here's a strange one that I'd never heard of before. It's called Fate, and it was released in 1996 from Intracorp. And actually, it turns out that the reason I hadn't heard of it is that it wasn't actually released, and all that exists is this demo, which you can find on all good abandonware sites. Here, there is a convoluted story about all sorts of strange things involving wizards and technology, and you play as a prisoner who escapes and has to do the usual DOS FPS things, like exploring maze-like levels, finding switches and keys to progress, and of course killing crazy enemies with massive weapons. I was surprised when I find out that this one actually uses the build engine, so it's the same engine as Duke Nukem 3D and Blood. I would never have guessed that, as the game looks nowhere near as good as either of those games, and granted, while it was never finished, everything does look a lot worse. Enemies have less detail and animation, weapon models are quite simple, and they're in the centre of the screen, which is more like the old, cheaper looking games. And even the levels themselves are much more pixelated. Though it does actually play quite well, and I have to say, I did kinda like it. There's a few weapons available here, mostly laser rifles, but they're fun to use. The levels that are here are massive and require a lot of exploring. There's puzzles throughout them too, where you'll need to shoot hidden switches, push barrels onto pressure blocks, and of course kill rooms full of enemies so doors will open. The enemies themselves are all pretty mad actually. You get a massive mix of them too. There's generic soldier men who drop weapons and ammo when you kill them. As well as this, there's goblins and spider monsters, flying monsters, and there's also a ton of traps to look out for. It's actually quite interesting to have all these things mixed together. Definitely keeps things fresh. The large levels are also pretty cool too. You have to do a lot of exploring and item finding to get anywhere, but I never found it to be too tedious. What's cool is that you also have an inventory management system that you'll need to use to combine items and create new ones. This includes putting together pieces of puzzles or keys. Something that is annoying though is that you're never told how many pieces of something that you need. Like in the first stage where you need to make a key for a door. I found about 8 or 9 pieces, but this still wasn't enough, and I never knew if I needed just 1 more bit or 5 more bits. It was a bit of a pain in the ass as I had to keep going back and forth to the door to see if the key that I'd made would work. Thankfully though, you do get a map, so you can easily see new areas you need to explore. The controls here are pretty good, standard stuff for a game like this, and it was very playable, and I did enjoy what I saw. It's actually a bit of a shame this was never released, though I don't think it would have taken the world by storm, but with a few changes and refinements I think it could have been a solid action game that would have offered something a little different from the norm. Another popular build engine game now with Redneck Rampage from Interplay. I remember having the big box version of this back in the day and absolutely loving it, though playing it again now it really hasn't held up, and I actually found it a bit of a chore to play. It's your standard redneck story. Aliens have invaded and taken over the deep south, making a load of redneck clones, so you have to go kill the bastards and save the world. Now, on paper, this game is great, as it looks good and plays almost great, but it has some big flaws that really let the whole thing down. The first thing is just the difficulty. Much like Blood, this is a freaking hard game. Enemies take a ton of shots to kill and are absolutely hit-scanning assholes. They'll shoot you from miles away, and if there's 3 or 4 enemies in a room, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to kiss your ass goodbye. Also, the balancing here is so strange. There's some enemies that take 3 or 4 shots, which is fine, but then there's the damn guard dogs which take about 10 point-blank shots with the shotgun or 3 or 4 rockets to kill. Meanwhile, they rip you apart in seconds. It doesn't really make sense, and avoiding most enemy attacks is basically impossible. The other issue here is the annoying level design. The levels here are massive, which would normally be alright, but there's no reason for them to be so big and convoluted. As you've guessed, you really need to find keys on every level, but the keys are tiny and never stand out, so they're always really easy to miss, meaning you can spend literally hours wandering around in circles only to spot a tiny key on a table at the back of a room that just looks empty. Or actually, in quite a few cases, there was times where I'd found the keys, I just didn't realise that I even had them. Keys in just about every other game I've played always really stand out with bright colours or they flash, but not here. And don't get me started on the fecking sewer levels, which are some of the most confusing, annoying levels in any game I've played. I'm not ashamed to admit that I just ended up using cheats to get all the keys and to be able to walk through walls to get past these stages. It's a shame, as I do love the look and feel of the game. It does play really well, even though I did start to notice quickly there's a lack of enemy variety and the fact there's barely any animation on just about anything. It does have a good sense of humour in the game though, and the weapons range from 6-shooters to shotguns and saw blades to alien arm cannons that are all good to use, but they do feel a bit underpowered, and also ammo is pretty hard to come by, so you will end up using your pistol for most of the game, and that has a really slow rate of fire and barely scratches some of the more powerful enemies. I am really desperate to like this game. especially as I remember loving it as a kid, but I'm pretty certain now that I never got past the first few levels. Time for another classic now, this time Shadow Warrior from 3D Realms themselves, where you play as the amazingly named Lo Wang on his mission to hunt down and kill the evil Zilla, who has an army of undead ninjas hell-bent on killing you. By now you already know how this plays. You've got a ton of levels split into a few chapters, each with their own end boss. You'll be doing lots of exploring and killing in order to find keys and switches that you need to open up new areas until you find the exit. But here there's a few extra things thrown in. For example, you get the occasional use of vehicles, which you'll need to repair by finding a repair kit somewhere on the level. These tend to only last a few minutes at a time, if you're lucky, but it is a nice change of pace. There are a ton of enemy types here, and same as Blood and Redneck Rampage, these are hit-scanning arseholes that often are a real pain in the ass. But although you'll still be dying quite a lot, this is much more forgiving than those games. Still not easy, but easier than those games. Enemies come in the forms of zombie ninjas, werewolf things, suicidal ghosts, and even sumos. There's quite a lot of variety. And yes, you do have a load of awesome weapons to take them out with. You've got your fists and a really powerful sword, as well as shurikens. And you can even have more modern weapons like shotguns and Uzis. And you get your normal rocket launchers, as well as decapitated enemy heads that shoot fire. It's all good fun. Something that does annoy me though is the grenade launcher, where the splash damage has a massive radius. It's a pretty powerful gun. You have to be miles away from enemies when you use it, or you'll take just as much damage as they do. In fact, I find myself just not bothering with it at all really, as I usually ended up dying myself. Thankfully though, the gunplay here is fantastic, and though ammo is pretty scarce, you'll always be equipped for the job, and even having to resort to your sword isn't too much of a problem, as it is really powerful, and you can cut through most enemies in just a few swings, but of course you do run the risk of taking a lot of damage up close. Graphically, as you can see, the game actually looks really cool with loads of detail. It's got a really nice style to it. The sound and music is also excellent, and Lo Wang spouts off a ton of actually funny one-liners, which is nice, and they never get old as they aren't overused. Shadow Warrior has had a few ports and remasters on PC, and there's a really good HD version that includes all of the expansion packs that I'd highly recommend. It's also got a reboot, with the latest installment being released only about a year or so ago. These are all really high quality games that are a ton of fun. If you haven't played any of them, I do recommend playing the lot. They're really good, and the new trilogy is available on most modern systems, so there's no reason for you not to check them out. And finally for today, a game that I really wish would get a remaster, which is Witchaven from Capstone Software. Now, Capstone aren't exactly known for making great games, but this one really stands out for me, and I'd have a bit of a soft spot for it. It's a dark fantasy FPS game where most of your weapons are swords, axes and maces, though you do have a few projectile like a bow and arrow, magic and some throwing axes. You're a knight on a quest to take out a bunch of evil witches and destroy their lairs. To do this, you need to do the usual thing of exploring levels, finding items and keys, and killing enemies. To exit levels though, you need to find a portal, which can only be activated after you've found a pentagram star looking item that's hidden somewhere on the level. So yeah, get ready to do a lot of exploring. The graphics here are kind of bad but good. Most of the enemies appear to be digitised clay models, and you know what? I really love the way it looks. There's quite a cool variety of enemies, some of which look really crap, some of which look really good, and I like it. Your character and weapons are all digitised sprites, and again, even though they have only 4 or 5 frames of animation, I still somehow really like the way it looks, and it makes the game stand out. This does affect the combat though, as you only hit enemies on certain frames of the animation cycle, though you can learn to use this to your advantage by timing attacks and your distance correctly. Interestingly, your weapons can also break, so you can't just use your most powerful sword all the time, and it forces you to choose the best weapon for certain situations. Thankfully, most weapons are dropped quite frequently though, so you don't have to be too stingy. Also, you level up as you play, making your attacks do more damage and weapons last longer. This is a cool mechanic, though isn't all that noticeable during gameplay if I'm honest. You'll find a number of potions and spells as you play too. These are actually pretty important in getting through the stages, as they not only give you health or strength power, but also there's potions that make you immune to fire or things like that, which doesn't just work for lava, but also some of the enemies attack you using fire spells, so you can just use one of these potions when they're knocking around and then they can't do diddly squat to you. I quite like this. You also get the ability to fly, which comes in handy in a few levels, but it's never required to complete the level. Something that is a shame here, and is actually kind of common in all of these games, is you can't customise the controls, which would be handy, especially as I'm playing on DOSBox on a MacBook, so I couldn't do some of the actions like looking up and down because my stupid computer doesn't have a page up and page down button. I mean, I guess I could have just plugged in my USB keyboard for that though. I didn't think of that. That's clever, isn't it? So yeah, really that's all there is to say about this one. It's another FPS game, but with a difference. I really do like this game, unironically, but I am well aware that it's not a particularly good game, but its unique style and setting really appeal to me. It even got a sequel, which I do own, but I can't get it to run, which is a shame, but I'll keep trying. So there you go, a bunch of old DOS shooters, some of which are still amazing, some of which haven't stood the test of time, and some that were just plain crap to begin with. What are some of your favourite DOS shooters? Let me know in the comments below, as I love these games and will definitely revisit this topic in the future. On screen now you can see where you can follow us, so why not do so? We have loads of cool content for everyone to enjoy. Now all that's left for me to say is thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.